evening, everybody. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping, well, actually not housekeeping issues, scheduling issues. Normally, we would have our next program the last Friday in April. Because of a conflict in schedule with the library, we have moved that to May 3rd. That's the program that our own David Miller will be presenting on the history of the Schultz family. And also in terms of programming, Frank Pelea is somewhere back here, yes, holding down the fort way in the back. And curator Frank Pelea is, you're going to be able to see his material at the Wilderstein 5th Outdoor Sculpture Biennial 2019, starting June 1st and running to October 31st. Thank you, Frank, for sharing that with us. And also, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I have something to share with all of you, and it's a gift, a magnificent gift that we received from somebody by the name of Anne Sturgill Platt de Buisson. There's a street in Rhinebeck called Platt Avenue. There's a governmental organization, a municipality called the Village of Rhinebeck that we're in right now. And there would not be a Village of Rhinebeck if there had not been a person by the name of Eliphalet Platt, Eli for short. Eli was one of the 5 original trustees of the village. He was a physician here in Rhinebeck. He lived on not on Platt Avenue, but on Route 9, where there's a dry cleaner right on Route 9. The property belongs to the Church of the Messiah, actually, and it's a portion of where the church property is. And that was his home. But he was important because he was chosen by that initial group of trustees as their leader. The term they used was president. And he was, in effect, our first mayor. And meetings were held at his home. And his descendant, I think she's his great-great-granddaughter, Anne Sturgill, has written I have a copy of her book. She did some research using the minutes of the Village of Rhinebeck that we had been working on. Sue Quimby isn't here this evening, but she's done a lot of work transcribing those minutes. And a lot of those minutes would refer over and over and over to the position that Eli took on various issues. And because of his work, we have a Village of Rhinebeck today. But what I'm showing you here, and what the Platt family, the de Buisson family now, has shared with us, is a pendant. Obviously you can't see it because it's relatively small. But this pendant on its backside has a kind of image known as a daguerreotype. Daguerre was a Frenchman who actually invented the technique that we now know as photography. And that technique was being used in France in very earliest days of daguerreotypes was in the late 1830s. Between 1840 and 1850, it migrated here to the United States. And we have tintypes after that date. But so that daguerreotype, which we believe dates from somewhere between 1840 and 1850, is one of the earliest daguerreotypes in the United States. And it's on the back of this pendant. From that image, a larger image has been made of Dr. Platt. We're this has been donated to us by the family. We had a conversation with our village mayor just yesterday, and we're seeking permission of the family who donated this to be able to do this. We're interested in being able to put this on temporary loan to the village of Rhinebeck and hang it somewhere convenient that everybody can see and that's secure in the village hall. So we'll see how that transpires, but in the meantime, I wanted to let all of you know that we have received this wonderful gift.
Is that the same plat that had Platt and Rogers business, the shellac
No,
business?
it's not.
That's not.
No, that was another. There was not only Dr. Eliphalet Platt, but his brother William Platt, who owned adjacent lots on the lot north of where Dr. Platt was the one actually right on the corner on top of which we now have the main part of the church itself. And it's after that family that Platt Avenue is named. But the shellac business that you're talking about that's near where you live, or was near where you live, was owned by, there were several families involved, but they were based, they were not from Rhinebeck, and they left Rhinebeck after there was a lot of concern about the adverse ecological impact of that shellac business in the 1910s and a little bit later.
No relationship to Lucky Platt, huh?
That was a case of the unlucky Platts.
Okay.
So, or at least the community was unlucky as a result of what they did. But that's another story for another time. Okay. Well, I'm pleased to be able to introduce this evening a speaker whose claim to fame prior to his work on the Albany Post Road was in the wine business. For some 17 years, Richard Figiel served as editor of 3 different wine magazines. He also has written Circle of Vines, and was a contributing writer for the Oxford Companion to the Wines of North America, and co-author of a Dictionary of American Wines, and was at that time living up on Seneca Lake, where he had his own winery. And more recently, he's moved southeast to Trumansburg, and we're delighted to be able to have him here this evening in Rhinebeck to tell us about America's oldest road. So, Richard, welcome.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. I will start by giving you a little background about how this book came about. As a kid, I used to travel up the Hudson Valley with my family to vacations, camping on islands in Lake George. And this was before the days of the highways. This was before the Thruway, before the Taconic Parkway was finished. So we took Route 9 up the valley. And Route 9 is often called the Albany Post Road. In fact, it really probably coincides with the Post Road, maybe half of the route between New York and Albany. And as we would journey up along the road, I, sitting in the back seat of our car, would be looking out the back window, and I'd notice fragments of old road that would leave Route 9 here and there, often abandoned, running off into farmland, sometimes with old stone walls alongside big old locust trees along it. And I was, as a kid, just fascinated by the sight of these odd roads that seemed to be going off into the past. And I, these many years later, decided that I was going to look into that and follow some of those roads and find out what I could find down those roads. In doing the research for this book, I soon became aware that many of the readers of the book, and no doubt a number of you, will know more about any particular section of this road than I could ever learn. My goal was to look at the road as a whole continuum from the beginning of the road down at the bottom of the valley, which is essentially the bottom of Manhattan Island, up to Lake George, and try to look at it as a continuum both geographically and historically. And I should say as an aside that Nancy Kelly was very kind to read the book. I should have gotten her to read it before I published it, because she quickly set me straight on a few things that I hadn't quite gotten right. Again, I'm sure that this is true all up and down the valley. There are folks who know more about their section than I will, but looking at it as a continuum was my job. One of the things that I did was to create what I call map guides. This is the first of 16 that appear in the course of the narration. This one showing the entire route from Bowling Green in Manhattan to Lake George. This entire route was created from an Indian path to a wagon lane to a road, and reached the head of Lake George in 1755. And that's as far as a road went up north for a number of decades after that. And to trace the route of the road, I needed to refer back to old maps. There are good 17th century maps of Manhattan, especially the lower end of Manhattan, and Albany, the two earliest settlements in the valley. The areas between and above Albany, a little bit harder to find early maps of those parts of the road. And one that was very useful to me was a series of maps created by Christopher Coles. Coles was a surveyor who worked with the Continental Army during the Revolution. And after the Revolution, he had the prescient idea, I think, of producing a booklet of maps of the first roads that were existing at that time in the new United States. And he published it in 1789. One section of the booklet covers the Albany Post Road, which was really not known yet quite as the Albany Post Road. It was until the Revolution known as the King's Highway, and even before that as the Queen's Highway. And you can see, this is one page of that booklet of maps. You can see that he has Rhinebeck Meeting House down at the lower left corner. So this covers the part of the road. There are 3 panels there. From left to right, it covers the part of the road that ran from Rhinebeck through Red Hook up to the point where the road crossed the Roloff-Jansen Kill, where that island and river is located up in the upper right. The map that I used, or that I will use here for lower Manhattan, is known as the Ratzer map. It was also done by a military surveyor, in this case a British Army surveyor, Bernard Ratzer. And I like it because it pretty clearly shows how the road started up from the foot of Manhattan, where the Dutch fort was located right down there, and you can still see the fort there Actually, it's right there. There are mentions in the early records of the Dutch settlement of an Indian path that ran up a ridge from the bottom of the island. And it was known as the Wequeesgek path. It was ultimately headed towards an Indian village further up the Hudson Valley that was the head village of the Wequeesgek tribe that I believe was associated with the Wappingers. And this is the route of that Indian trail running up a ridge here. This was a sort of a boggy area down here. The Dutch had no problem with boggy areas. That was quickly drained, and they settled a lot down here. But this was became their main road in and out of New Amsterdam. Of course, well, they called it the Heerstraat, the high road or the high street, and then it became known in English days as Broadway. And if we follow that road up at this point here, and it passes now Trinity Church and St. Paul's Chapel. At this point, the road encountered, and the Indian path encountered an area around this pond and a connection between the pond and the Hudson River, and a large marshy area that surrounded that connection. So it couldn't proceed straight into that boggy area, and it bent over to the east and followed what we now know as Park Row. Park Row today passes through this point here, which is now Chatham Square, and very close to the road at Chatham Square there is a fragment of a Jewish cemetery that was established in the 16th century. It was there at least at 1683 and probably 1656. It was created by a reluctant Peter Stuyvesant. He was not known as the most tolerant leader even in Dutch communities, but he was kind of forced by the Governors General of Holland to give the Jews of that time a place where they could lay to rest their dead. And fascinating to see this. It used to be much larger. It was on a hillside overlooking the East River. Now just a very small fragment of it, but it's kind of perched up above the sidewalk and the road past it, the side road off of Chatham Square, and a little piece of history that's I think often not even noticed by people passing that area. At that point, the road became known as the Bowery, and the word Bowery, of course, is a Dutch word for farms, and this was the farming area for the Dutch that provided food for New Amsterdam. And even in 1767, we can still see that there's a lot of farmland up in this area here. The Bowery, again, following the old Indian path. Today it passes through Union Square, and at Madison Square, the old path and the old road turned off more to the east for various reasons that have to do with the topography of the island. And at that point, the old road was obscured in the very early 1800s by the imposition of the grid of streets and avenues that we know well in mid-Manhattan today. Here's a drawing of one section of the grid It was created by a surveyor. The job of laying out the grid was given to a surveyor named John Randall, and he produced a series of what he called farm maps that showed the grid of avenues and streets, and in this case showed the old post road kind of running, curving, angling up through this section. The imposition of the grid required the virtual leveling of the whole midsection of Manhattan Island. Very controversial, filling in marshy areas like this, brooks like this, in some cases ponds, tearing down houses that were along the river. Here's one that came right in the middle of an intersection. And there were a couple of houses on the old road, again another one right in an intersection, all taken down. Very controversial plan, and we can see one reason why. Here's the work in progress, and you can see that it was a very rugged terrain in places, and in some cases houses were left stranded up on these hillocks. You can tell by the cant of this house up here that it's not really aligned with the highway or the avenue running north here, which happens to be 2nd Avenue. And because we know the location of this spot, we can pretty well understand that this house up here was located on the old post road as it angled through this area. And of course that house is doomed. All of these hills were pushed either into low spots or ponds or into the Hudson River itself to expand the girth of the island. One of the people who was not a fan of the grid was Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape designer of Central Park. And Central Park was not part of the original plan for the grid, but by the time this took a period of decades for all of this to be constructed and all by hand. By the time the city council went a couple of decades into this, they realized that they hadn't left enough green space in the middle of the island. And so they set up the parameters of Central Park. Frederick Law Olmsted was in charge of laying out the park. He found that a piece of the old post road actually ran through the section of the park. And so he incorporated it into his design, and it's now the East Drive of Central Park. So at about 90th Street, where you can enter the park on East Drive, you can follow the old post road up through the northeastern corner of Central Park. Okay, moving on, as we will do here, kind of jumping up along the road, along the valley. The old road, the Indian Path and the old road passed through the heart of Yonkers, at that point coming very close to the river. And the Indian Path, where downtown Yonkers is now, crossed what the Indians called the Nepperhan Creek, which became known as Sawmill River in colonial days. And Frederick Phillips, who was the manor lord of that area, very powerful, wealthy Dutch merchant, built a mill right where downtown Yonkers is located now, dammed up the Nepperhan River, or the Nepperhan Creek, or the Sawmill River, for a mill pond, and built a manor house there. The manor house is still there, fascinating place to visit. It was at one time used as the city hall of Yonkers. The mill pond was eventually filled in. The Nepperhan or Sawmill River itself was buried into a culvert that ran under downtown Yonkers. Over what had been the mill pond, there was a very large parking lot in the mid-1900s. To their credit, in 2010, the Yonkers City Council decided that they wanted to do something about the fact that the middle of Yonkers was just this huge parking lot. And they decided to bring back the Neperhan. They uncovered the creek, which had been running underground there, and it's now part of a linear park that runs right through the heart of downtown Yonkers and runs right past the manor house of the Phillipsburg Manor, and is surrounded by old photographs and maps that recall the history of the area and how it had changed over the years. And it's a striking contrast to what happened in Manhattan. Here they were restoring the old resources and the old location, whereas in Manhattan much of it was buried. As the road heads north from Yonkers, we begin to see milestones appearing alongside it. And the milestones were set in the late 1700s. The purpose of the milestones really was to set postal rates. The postage was based on how far a letter or a packet went, and typically was paid. The postal rate was paid by the receiver rather than the sender. Hence the Albany Post Road. The name then became associated with the delivery of mail. The next part of the road that I found particularly interesting was the area around the Croton River. Whoops, okay, let's get back here. And here is a map drawn by that same John Randall who laid out the grid in Manhattan. He took a break from his work in Manhattan, was hired by the City Council in Albany to survey and map the road as it ran from Albany to New York. And it was, again, a series of maps, and this is one that covers that section around the Croton River. And as the road approached the river, it reached a fairly wide section of the estuary. It's not as wide as that now, because it has been filled in a lot over the years with a lot of material coming down the river. So the Indian Path and the road bent up along the river, kind of curved around a tributary here, Indian Brook, and looked for a narrower place where there was a ford across the river, which eventually was ferried, and then by 1810 a bridge built there. And you can see Hunt's Tavern here, J. Hunt's Tavern. That predated the Revolution, and it's still there. It's not a tavern, it's a private house, but it's still located just at the point where the road bends down down the embankment to the river. Problem with this bridge and with a number of bridges that cross the Croton, every few years there would be such a huge flood coming down the very extensive watershed of the Croton that it would wash out these bridges. And there were a few of them built, each time a little further up the river, trying to avoid the calamity that happened to the predecessor. And eventually there was a bridge off this map that I was interested in tracing, and the road now continues up beyond this point, continues up the bank, and was at a later date known as the Albany Post Road. and went up to what was called the Croton High Bridge. I followed the road up as far as I could, and eventually it became somebody's driveway. So I went up to the house and knocked on the door, and a fellow came down, and I told him what I was doing. And he was great. He said, "Oh, okay, let me get my jacket on." And he came out and took me up past his property line to where you could still follow an abandoned section of the Albany Post Road running through the woods up to the huge stone embankments of the Croton High Bridge, which unfortunately wasn't there anymore. In 1879, it collapsed into the river. I'm told, or I read, that it was only a couple of weeks after it was deemed unsafe, so that was rather a close call. When we came back down to his house, I was struck by the sight of his swimming pool by his house, which was right in the middle of the Albany Post Road. Okay, on the other side of the river, the road came back down the west bank, passed by the ferry house. This is where the ferry had crossed, and apparently D. Merritt was the ferryman at this time in 1810, and also passed around by the Van Cortlandt Manor House. Both of them still there. Fascinating place to visit. Owned by the historic Hudson organization, and by the ferry house there's an old bell that was used to summon the ferryman if he happened to be on the other side of the river. The house itself dates back way back into the 1600s. It is probably the oldest house that we'll pass in our trip up the river. And it's full of fascinating artifacts. It's definitely worth a visit if you get a chance. Beyond Croton, the road passes through Peekskill and then begins to climb over the Hudson Highlands. And at that point, it's a really interesting section of the old road that is still used minimally, was bypassed around the time that this map was made by a turnpike that cut off some of the sections of the original route, the original both Indian path and the first route of the old road. And this is about a little over 6 mile section of the road. Oh, well, here's a picture of the Croton High Bridge. I should have shown that a minute earlier. You can see quite a bit above the river. Not in any danger from flooding, but unfortunately still in danger of the weather. Here's the road along that 6 mile section, still identified as the Albany Post Road. When the new turnpike was built, it siphoned the stagecoach traffic and a lot of the other traffic along this section, and it then remained fairly untouched for a century and a half, really. And in recent years, protected by folks in the neighborhood and who live along the road. There are a few houses along the road. They call themselves the Old Road Society of Phillipstown. And they have worked hard to keep it as a dirt road. There were efforts to pave it. They managed to block them. There are stone walls along the road that were built when the road was created from an Indian path back in the 1750s by the British Army when they were moving up the road to the battlefront of the French and Indian War. Really fun to walk or ride along this area, this part of the road. All of the milestones are still there except for one, and it gives you a real feeling for passing through a wilderness, which was a pretty rough part of the road back in the 1700s and even early 1800s. You can see the motto of the Old Road Society: "Say yes to dirt." That says it all. After the road comes down off the highlands and feeds back into Route 9, it's a rather jarring transition from this sort of pastoral section back into the maelstrom of 21st century life. The road then passes up through Figiel and through Wappingers Falls, and as it approaches Poughkeepsie, it's a 4-lane highway, really, almost. And I passed up and down a section there of the busy road a number of times before I noticed that there was an old stone farmhouse alongside the road, back in the woods, all overgrown. I did some poking around and learned that it was known as the Fort Homestead. It never was a fort, it was the homestead of the Fort family. And it was slated to be demolished for a residential development in the pretty recent years. But at the very, very 11th hour, a lot of folks in Poughkeepsie, in the Historical Society in particular, started howling about it and managed to save the place. Now everybody has to figure out what to do with it. They're not sure whether it should be a private house or it could be some kind of a museum, but it just sits there in limbo. Around the back of the house, there's a pane of glass with an etching that was done during the Revolution, and there's a really interesting story attached to that. It has a date on it. Unfortunately, the story's too long for me to tell now, so you have to read it in the book.
Where exactly is that?
It's very close to where the road crosses Casper Creek. It's, I'd say, 1.5 miles south of Poughkeepsie.
It's about opposite Southgate Drive.
Yes.
And at the corner of Southgate Drive and Route 9,
Right.
on a hill there is the graveyard for the...
Right, yeah, it's right where, I think it's where the graveyard starts pretty much in that area, doesn't it?
Well, there's a little graveyard right in back of the deli there or whatever that's right at the intersection of Southgate Drive and Route 9.
Uh-huh, yeah.
I think it's opposite Red Lobster, and
Yeah.
it's still, I think, part of what was IBM Country Club.
Right,
Yes,
yeah,
I
because,
did
I
own it
don't
for a
know.
while.
yeah, IBM owned it, and I think they sold it to a developer or arranged for it to
Yeah.
be developed. And yeah, the cemetery that you're talking about was the Fort family
Yes,
cemetery.
right.
Yeah,
And it's right across Route 9.
right, yeah. The two villages, in my estimation, along the entire route of the road that I followed, that are most interesting historically and that were most attendant to trying to preserve their past are Rhinebeck and Kinderhook. And Rhinebeck is the subject of this particular section of that St. John Randall map from 1810. The road, as it's shown here, is very, very close to the road that Christopher Coles mapped in 1789. So things hadn't changed much. The Beekman Arms at that time was run by Captain William Jacques. His stage house, it says, and post office. There's the milestone 98 that's set into the wall along the road, along Mill Street today. Milestone 99, where the road is headed down to cross Rhinebeck Creek. And just today, actually, when I came into town on Mount Rutson Road, I hadn't ever noticed that there's a milestone right here at this intersection.
That used to
It
be
was
further
moved.
up.
And that must have been the stone of milestone 100, which was further up the road, right?
Yeah, they moved it from up there, I guess they were doing road work and they moved it down at the point.
Do you know when they did that? What?
He might.
It was, according to Elma Williamson, who was the daughter of the Staley family, he found it interfered with his ability to, whatever he was farming there, it got in his way, and he moved it.
Well, it
And I
wasn't
guess
the only.
nobody told him you can't do that.
Yeah, I guess anybody who might have told them you can't do that wasn't around any longer. And it wasn't unusual for some of these stones to be moved. One indication that they might be on the right at the right location is that they were always on the west side of the road. So if you see one on the right side of the road, then you either know the road moved or the stone moved. Yes.
The first time that the mileage was done it started in Albany and the numbers ran south. And you can see that on the map.
Yeah,
But
well,
the stones run north in
right, right. The
Why
stone,
did that happen?
the stones measure the distance from New York to set the postal rates. When you see these miles, for example, 58 here, 59 here, because Randall was hired by the Albany City Council, he started in Albany and measured the mileage from Albany. So those don't actually indicate milestones, they just indicate his mileage when he surveyed the road.
Right, thank you.
And the one house that I think is still surviving up here is the Cox house, which I think is Schiffman's house now. And they've fixed it up. It's a beautiful place.
Does someone live in the Brenner house? I know where that is.
Yes, yeah. I don't know who lives there now.
Elijah does, right?
Elijah Bender,
Yeah, right.
What's the name?
Bender.
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 It's close to
Brenner
Brenner.
House.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that the person who owns Foster's?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, you've cleared up one of my questions was where is milestone 100 and what happened to it?
That would have been, what, 1900 though, that you would have done that?
It would have been probably in the 19... She was born in 1929.
Oh, well, she's, okay.
I don't ever remember her telling me when it happened.
But it was
her-
early.
Yeah, I mean, it was
Well
probably
done.
around 1930, 40, I have no idea. Except that he did it and he lived, and I mean, he would have died in the 1940s, I think, so it had to be before then.
Yeah.
Rhinebeck, of course, was something of an anomaly in the valley in that as you pass along the old road and encounter some of the old church cemeteries, graveyards, see a lot of Dutch names, sometimes Dutch inscriptions on the stone, but around Rhinebeck, you're seeing German names and German inscriptions. And that, of course, goes back to what was really the first major immigration of Germans into America back in the very early 1700s, brought here by
They were Palatines brought invited by Livingston.
Yeah,
No, but it was the people in England that sent them.
yeah. Well, yeah. He
Livingston-
quote unquote
Livingston
took care of
sent
them when they got here.
Yep.
But yeah, they were, I think, brought to well, at least in part to try to supply the British Navy with masts and tar and things like that they needed. I was interested to find right outside of the old stone church, which this stone in German which my wife translated for me, and I'll read it. 1734 is died 6 and buried Berhard Zippling, the 18 March, was old 65 year and 6 month. And presumably the 12 days between the 6th and the 18th, when he died and when he was buried, gave them time for the ground to thaw enough so that they could dig the grave.
Where is that? Near the, up above,
It's on the north side of the Stone Church, St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church,
oh,
where Stone Church Road runs into Route 9.
Yeah, very close to the wall of the church. You can see the
up
wall
where
of
the
the church.
aerodrome is in that area?
Yeah.
Before you get there,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Continuing on, as the road approaches Kinderhook, it at that point is identified now as Route 9H. It makes a bend right when it encounters Lindenwold, the home of President Van Buren. He was a native of Kinderhook and was born there, and always intended to go back to his birth village after his time as president, which he expected to be 8 years, but turned out only to be 4. He bought an 18th century house. It was built in the late 1700s, and hired the architect actually who built Lyndhurst to make a lot of additions and put on a tower and create a real mansion there, where the excuse me, where the modern road 9H passes in front of Lindenwold, and the house itself. There's a section of dirt road that was actually the original roadbed of the Albany Post Road, and if you follow that little section there past the parking lot for the historic site, for the National Historic Site, it continues into the woods, and you come to this bridge, all overgrown, very narrow. You can see roughly the width of it by these 2 posts. At this point, there's not really a road. There is still a path across it. The narrowness of the bridge suggests to me that it was in use before the days of stagecoaches. It's too narrow for that. Looks like it was built really as a bridge for a bridle path, or maybe a narrow farm wagon, which makes me wonder if this couldn't possibly be the oldest bridge in New York. I did an internet search for oldest bridges in New York or oldest bridges in the Hudson area or whatever. There doesn't seem to be any kind of a catalog of there's catalogs for oldest everything else, but apparently not bridges. So it's just it's a guess, but the path that leads across it is part of some paths that run around the property of Lindenwold, so you can walk through there, and it's quite interesting to see. This section of abandoned road feeds back into Route 9H as you're headed into Kinderhook, and you begin to encounter some of the really beautiful old houses of Kinderhook. First one is the Van Allen house, 1737, and a really nice example of a very simple Dutch-style cottage farmhouse with a single, pretty steep pitched roof, addition that just followed the same pattern that was added soon after the original. And then as you get into the village itself, the old road, which at that point is William Street, passing through the village, you come to the Prine House, which I found to be a really good example of the prosperity that the early settlers found in working this very rich farming territory around Kinderhook. Some of the best farming land in the state. And here you see that the upstairs was filled out by the addition of the gambrel roof, which is associated with Dutch architecture, but really is an English architectural element originally. Dormer windows, so that they can build a much larger living area inside, and a lot of beautiful brick detail in this house. Here's a close-up of the gable end with the date of the house running across the windows, and some nice woodwork, brickwork up above. Kinderhook is probably at least a couple of dozen 18th century houses. Beautiful village. After Kinderhook, the road eventually comes back to the Hudson River at Rensselaer and at the next old house that we come to. Whoops. You're right, you really can't hold your finger on this very long. The Craylow house, which many of you may know. There is a stone in the foundation of this house with the date 1642 and the initials KVR. The initials stand for Kilian van Rensselaer, who was the first Dutch patroon of New Netherlands and settled the area on either side of the Hudson around 1630. That date probably, and that stone probably belonged to an earlier house on the site. This one is generally considered to have been built by Kilian's grandson in about 1707 and became very important as military headquarters during the French and Indian War and again during the American Revolution, surrounded by huge campgrounds of the armies at that time. You can see that it went through a rather derelict stage in 1880. Was used in many ways over the years, but now it's a really spectacular museum of Dutch history and culture that's certainly worth a visit.
Where is that, Rensselaer?
Yeah, it's on the south edge of Rensselaer, but right on the river, and not too far from where the modern bridge crosses over to Albany. This is what's known as Riverside Avenue now, running in front of it, and that runs up along the river, and not too far from Craylow it comes to a street called Ferry Street, and then there's another ferry street on the other side of the river, and they mark essentially where the ferry used to run across the river and was active for 2.5 centuries.
Was it the British military that you were using that, or the...
British and then the Americans, yeah, in the French and Indian War and then in the American Revolution.
What's a musket called?
Muskets were the rifles of the day, and just a small hole created in the wall so that they could just fit the barrel of the musket through there without exposing anybody inside the building.
And they can't see what they're shooting?
It's big enough so that they can sight along the barrel.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, we'll cross the river, and another map of schematic map of Albany in the very late 17th century. The road that we're following came up from the river, right, entered the stockade of the village. It says Handler Street here, the name that was given during Dutch days. That is now Broadway running through Albany. Here's State Street that ran up to the English fort, the fort that the English built to replace Fort Orange, the Dutch fort. And this is approximately where the state capitol is located now. Broadway was lined at this time, well into the early 1700s, with Dutch houses in the style of that Van Allen house, but with the gable end facing the street, which was the more urban style in New Netherlands, yes.
Why did it cross the river and not just keep going up the east side?
Because it wanted to go to Albany. The fort was
Indians
on.
wanted to go to Albany.
Well, the Indians had a canoe crossing there because their paths ran on both sides of the river and off into what was what's now New England.
Then they had to
But
deal
the
with
Dutch,
the Mohawk River. If they stayed over here, they wouldn't have had to do that.
Well, they crossed the Mohawk around where Scotia is now, and often carried down to this part of the Hudson, the edge of the Hudson. So there was a carry that essentially ran between Schenectady and Albany. But the Dutch built on the west side of the river. That's where the fort was. So that's where you needed to go. And that's where the settlement began, around
I
the
know.
fort.
The Indians didn't need to do
The Indians did not need to do it. No,
Did
but
they trade furs or something?
Yeah,
They wore
yeah,
furs to Albany?
that was really the reason for the settlement of the fort of Fort Orange, was to trade with the Indians furs, what they would bring down from the Mohawk Valley and the Upper Hudson Valley and that surrounding area. Hence the name Beverwyck for the early Dutch settlement there for the beavers.
that. That could be the reason.
Yeah. The Dutch houses that lined Albany are all gone except for one. There's one that's still located over here in this part, where you can see that the village was already spilling outside of the boundaries of the palisade. And the house that's left here was built by the Quackenbush family in the early 1700s. It survives as a pub, the Old English pub, where I ate dinner last night.
Still doing business?
Yeah.
Okay, there, yes.
Yeah, neat place.
Good British
And I'm
style.
not paid to say that either. Okay, here's another one of those map guides showing the route of the road running north from Albany. There's Cralo down here. Not far out of Albany, the modern road, Broadway, Route 32, no longer represents the original track of the road. It was closer to the river, and in fact the river was closer to the orange line that you see there, which approximates the original course of the road. There are a few sections of dirt road, more or less abandoned, that you can find around Schuyler Flats and a little bit south of there in this area. But not a lot to see there. And then the road continued up and crossed the islands of the Mohawk Delta and on to the north. And at that point, we'll jump up to Schuylerville. And yeah, we're passing the area of the Saratoga battlefields. And in Schuylerville, we come to the Marshall House, which is a scene that was quite dramatic at the very end of the campaign of General Burgoyne and the battles of Saratoga. And at this point, I'll read you a little section from the book, if I may. Marshall House was the scene of a harrowing week in October 1777, recounted in the diary of Baroness Frederica de Riedesel, wife of the Prussian commander of Burgoyne's Hessian regiments, which made up almost half of the total British force. Madame de Riedesel traveled with her 3 daughters in a calash among the vehicles of hundreds of camp followers, sutlers, families of soldiers, cooks, nurses, mistresses, prostitutes, trailing behind the British Army. The entourage included 30 wagons carrying gentleman Johnny Burgoyne's essentials, his dinnerware, his wardrobe, his traveling wine cellar, etc. During the final days of the campaign, Riedesel took shelter in the Marshall House with her daughters, servants, and other camp followers and wounded officers. American artillery battered them from across the river, believing the house was Burgoyne's headquarters. Riedesel wrote in her diary, quote, "We were at last obliged to descend into the cellar, where I laid myself in a corner near the door. My children lay down on the earth with their heads upon my knees. An abominable smell, the cries of the children, and my own anguish of mind did not permit me to close my eyes during the whole night. The women and children, being afraid to venture forth, soiled the whole cellar. 11 cannonballs passed through the house, and we could plainly hear them rolling over our heads. We were in want of water, and in order to quench our thirst, I was often obliged to drink wine from the house's wine cellar and give it also to the children. I was the only one of all the women whose husband had not been killed or wounded." End quote. And they spent 6 more days in that way before Burgoyne finally surrendered. In 1870, the house looked probably pretty similar to what it looked like in Riedesel's day. And in 2018, this is a picture I took of it. I walked up to the house and intending to ask the owners if they would mind if I take a picture of the house. A woman came up to the upstairs window, and I asked her if I could do that. And she said, "Oh, wait a minute." And she came downstairs and led me inside, and I spent an hour and a half with Hilary Tan and David Bullard, the owners of the house. They showed me throughout the whole house, the cellar, lifted up a corner of the rug in one of the rooms to show me the blood stains that were still on the floorboards of the house from when it had been used to perform surgery on some of the wounded soldiers. And on the mantle over the fireplace, there were 3 of those 11 cannonballs sitting there in the house. Turns out that the Bullard family is only the second family to own the house since the Revolution. And both families have really kept a sense of the history, although, of course, not the actual look of the house.
Right.
It's a beautiful place now. Close to where the Marshall House is, and this is on the north edge of Schuylerville, the road crossed back over the Hudson River and went up the east side. And at that point, we can see what it looks like today. It hugged the shore of the Hudson, as you can see, and this is known as River Road. It's not the modern road that runs up to Fort Edward. It runs into what's known as the Fort Miller area. Again, several miles of just a pastoral road through the woods, dirt road, beautiful, especially along the river like that. And some nice old houses along it, although none dating as far back as the Marshall House, because this part of the upper road was just ravaged by the back and forth of the armies during the Revolution. Unlike this section, once we get past Fort Edward and especially past Glens Falls on Route 9, we run into a lot of development, a lot of strip malls north of Glens Falls especially. The road probably doesn't follow the exact route of the Indian path that was created as a military road in 1755 that extended all the way up to Lake George. However, in the woods behind a Home Depot in this area north of Glens Falls, we come upon Blind Rock. And this was a very famous rendezvous site and campsite way back in Indian days. It more or less marked the frontier between the territories of the Iroquois and the Algonquin nations, and has a long history in that regard. If you just happened upon it, it's just another erratic boulder in the woods, but really quite an icon. It was a marker for the British Army when they created the road between the Hudson River and Lake George. And then it became a benchmark for the surveyors who laid out that area when it was settled. And from here, the road passes through, after running out of strip malls, I guess they have to end at some point, it runs through another section of woods where it was used to create a bike path, which is again a really nice section of it to follow. And finally, in this Stoddard photo, you can see it winding down to the head of Lake George. And this was a photograph taken somewhere around 1900. And that brings us to the end of the old road. Question?